Welcome to the second session of 2025 Great Decision Series presented by the Indiana Council on World Affairs. Tonight's program is entitled U.S.-China Relations, Intense Times, Trade, Technology, and Taiwan. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Paul Heer. Paul is a non-resident senior fellow in the Lester Crown Center on U.S. Foreign Policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. He's a veteran of 30 years as an analyst for East Asian Affairs at the Central Intelligence Agency. He served as National Intelligence Officer for East Asia in the Office of the Director of National Intelligence from 2007 to 2015. He is a recipient of the CIA's Distinguished Career Intelligence Medal. The ODNI might tell us what that means here at some point, Paul. National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal, and is a life member of the Council on Foreign Relations. So with that, Paul, maybe we could get started. This is obviously an important topic. Some of our participants have looked at the article in the Great Decisions book, but maybe you could have a couple comments to kind of kick us off before we start the question area.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Ray. I'm just delighted for the opportunity to be here to talk to you as another proud Midwesterner. And ODNI stands for the Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
Okay, great.
That's where the National Intelligence Council has been housed for the last 15 years. And in fact, a new DNI was confirmed by the Senate just today, Tulsi Gabbard. Like I said, I'm just really delighted to be here to talk to you all about China. And I won't go into detail on the Great Decisions article, but I mean, I assume some of you have read it. I just wanted to make a couple of points from the Great Decisions volume. It was written by Tom Christensen, who's an old friend of mine. I've known him for a long time. He's a scholar currently at Columbia University, but he's also been at Princeton and at MIT. And actually, he was in the worked for the State Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs during the George W. Bush administration. And I highly recommend the article that he's written. It's entitled Competition, Cold War, and Conflict, and it's just a really great survey of the issues in U.S.-China relations. There's just 2 points in it that I wanted to highlight. We may come back to some of these themes that I thought were particularly important as kind of a scene setter, when the article is a scene setter. Tom, he basically starts the article by saying, and I strongly agree with this, that there seems to be agreement in Washington that the United States is in a profound strategic competition with China, but less agreement in Washington on what we should do about that, how we should counter it and compete with China. The one caveat I would add there, I think is important, is although I agree that we are in competition with China, there's general agreement in Washington that we're in competition with China. I don't think that there's full agreement on actually the nature and the scope of that competition. And by that I mean that the prevailing view is that China poses an existential threat to the United States. Because its goal is to replace the United States as the leader of the world and to impose its illiberal system on the rest of the world. I actually, and this is a highly debatable and highly debated point. I think it's less than that. I think that China does not aspire to become the global hegemon. I think they know that global hegemony, even if it was achievable, would not be sustainable, and that trying to pursue it would probably be destabilizing and potentially even counterproductive to their interest. And in fact, I should have mentioned this. I published an article that really emphasizes this point in the national interest just a few days ago. I can send a link later on. I think that China is basically trying simply to maximize its role in the world relative to that of the United States. China's been pursuing the maximization of its wealth and power and influence for 150 years, and the balance of power in the 21st century has given them incentives to do so. And in fact, I think the Chinese believe they are well positioned to do so because of the historic shifts in the balance of power since the end of the Cold War and since the global financial crisis. And then we can come back to that. I think that the second point, which fully flows from that, which is Tom starts the article, Christensen started the article with that observation about the agreement on the competition, and he ends the article by highlighting the lack of clarity in Washington is what the end state or what the goal of the U.S.-China competition should be. He has this great quote. He says, competition is a state of being. It's not a strategic goal. And he makes the point, which I agree with, that Washington at this point does not seem to have a clear vision of victory as to what it is the competition is over. And I think this is partly because we seem to be approaching this as a zero sum or a winner take all competition, which I think my own view is that it is not necessarily zero sum, and we should not attribute the goal of taking over the world or attribute the fact of it being a zero sum contest to Chinese ambitions. I think we need to pursue, we need to recognize, I believe, that China's goal is less than that of destroying the American way of life and supplanting us as the global hegemon. And I'm just a strong supporter and advocate for strategic engagement with China, because I think that's the more viable path forward rather than inviting and putting all of our attention into a zero-sum competition. Because the alternative is to run the risk of getting into another Cold War. And I think Tom talks about this in the article as well. And my concern is that we may be toying with that trajectory right now. Anyway, those were the only opening remarks I wanted to make because I just thought that Tom's article was very good at highlighting that strategic setting for the U.S. for any discussion of U.S.-China relations.
Okay, well,
Thank
you for kind of setting the stage a little bit. I'm kind of I think a little bit about history. I mean, we are where we are today because of the past to a certain extent. And I can remember when Nixon went to China and how was China regarded back then? I sort of remember movies like The Manchurian Candidate when there was this hysterical fear of communism and so forth. And even Vietnam was viewed as an opportunity to prevent the dominoes of East Asia falling to communism. What was the fear back then? Was it more kind of philosophical than political or economic? Did that transition over time?
Actually, there was a lot of evolution of that over time. I think at the time, China was not so much. I think we were at an inflection point at the time of Nixon's and Kissinger's opening to China. I would say in the early 70s, certainly what was driving Nixon and Kissinger was the perception of China being more of an opportunity than a threat. You talked about the Manchurian Candidate, but that movie was about 10 years earlier. And I think that at that time, in the early 60s, we generally saw China as, closely aligned with the Soviet Union as part of the international communist conspiracy, which was certainly one of the central themes of the movie. But that's because we weren't quite aware yet of the alienation that was happening between Beijing and Moscow at that time. They were in the early stages of competing for leadership in the international communist movement, and their ideological differences that started to emerge after, I won't go back into Soviet history, but Khrushchev made this very important, famous speech in 1956, the de-Stalinization of the Soviet Union. And that was one of the things that fueled disagreements between Beijing and Moscow about what communism should be trying to accomplish internationally. We didn't know about that very much in the early 60s, but by the early 70s, the Sino-Soviet split was something that was pretty well established. And I think that basically what we saw there was Nixon trying to take advantage of that. He saw an opportunity there to take advantage of the Sino-Soviet differences and establish a cooperative relationship with China that we could use to balance off against the Soviet Union. China certainly wasn't seen as an economic threat at the time because its economy was still backward. They were still in the throes or in the later stages of the Cultural Revolution. China was a very insular, autarkic country at the time, but they still had the strategic significance. I think you're right when you mentioned Vietnam. We certainly, Nixon saw he certainly wanted to try to bring an end to the war in Vietnam, and he saw the potential for Chinese cooperation in that regard because of China's relationship with Vietnam. And I think he thought that he could, actually, Ambassador Quinn knows a lot more about this than I do, but I think that Nixon saw the potential to play on Chinese influence in Vietnam at the expense of Soviet influence in Vietnam. So I think the bottom line there is really that in 1972, when Nixon went to China, there was the perception that we had a common enemy, or at least a common adversary that we could play off against. And Nixon was basically trying to take advantage of that. So China was seen at that time as less of a threat to us than the Soviets were, and as providing us kind of more of an opportunity because of the tensions in their relationship.
So when do you think the transition occurred that we started seeing China as an economic threat?
Oh, I think that that only really came, I mean, 20 and 30 years later. Was after, I mean, one of the products or one of the side effects that we hoped of engagement with China was to bolster its economy. But it wasn't until the late 90s and really after the turn of the century that we started to get a little frightened. When China's economic growth became so spectacularly successful, and its influence economically, internationally, started to rival that of the United States. And this was really driven home in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. So I think it's really, that's the beginning of the perception of China as an economic challenge and even an economic threat to the United States, because their competitiveness has grown. And ours, frankly, I mean, this was one of the things that was reflected in the financial crisis. Our competitiveness has suffered over the last 15 years relative to that of the Chinese. Our economy is still, you know, substantially larger, but they're catching up. And I think that's it's the relative trajectories that I think have fueled the perception of China as a major economic threat.
Mhm. The briefing book spends a fair amount of time talking about Taiwan. We'll jump into that right away here, I guess. And, you know, obviously different presidents have kind of worked on this concept of strategic ambiguity. Why do we have so much difficulty kind of phrasing a policy towards Taiwan? Is that something, this strategic ambiguity, is that actually the way we want to go with this, or is there a better solution to this situation?
Well, actually, there's a lot to unpack on the Taiwan issue. And it's one of my favorite topics to talk about because I've worked a lot on it, both in and out of government. But strategic ambiguity, I think, is still better than the alternative. The alternative, generally viewed today, is strategic clarity. Over the last several years, people have said that, you know, well, for those of you who are, you know, there's a lot of word games and kind of religious interpretation to all of the history of the terminology of the Taiwan issue. But strategic ambiguity basically is the U.S. decision to keep both Beijing and Taipei guessing as to whether we would intervene militarily to prevent China from taking over the island. And this is intended both to deter the Chinese from using force against Taiwan, but it's also to deter Taiwan from taking U.S. support for granted and pushing the envelope toward some kind of declaration of independence. Because of Chinese coercive behavior over the last several years, a lot of people advocated clarity, making it clear that we would, in fact, intervene militarily to defend Taiwan. And in fact, President Biden, arguably in violation of official U.S. policy, hinted or even went beyond hinting in that direction several times. I think strategic ambiguity is still highly preferable because I think strategic clarity would be highly problematic. In fact, I think it would give the Chinese more of an excuse to use force than it has now. I mean, the reason I think strategic ambiguity works is that the Chinese have long presumed that we would intervene militarily, but ambiguity allows them, it serves Chinese purposes by because it's at least consistent with the commitments that we made to Chinese during the normalization process. And I don't need to go into chapter and verse on the Nixon Shanghai communique and the normalization community and there were the three communiques are kind of the founding documents of U.S.-China relations. But this was supplemented by the Taiwan Relations Act, which in 1979, when we normalized relations with China, provided the basis for us to sustain an unofficial relationship with Taiwan. But one of the central requirements of that was that we ended the defense pact we had with the Republic of China, now known as Taiwan. And strategic clarity from Beijing's perspective, and I think from most strategic analysts' perspective, would essentially reinstate that defense pact. And the Chinese would see that as a violation, frankly, of the common understandings that made U.S.-China relations possible. The problem, I think, with strategic ambiguity, even though it has served us well, and it's even served China and Taiwan well, is that the ambiguity has become less credible and less persuasive over the last several years, over the last few decades, actually. It's partly because of the rhetoric, the statements that have been made by President Biden and even predecessors who hinted at a stronger relationship with Taiwan than the Chinese have ever wanted us to have. But I think it's also because there are fundamentally inherent dilemmas in the U.S. position on this issue. I actually think that if we want to make our stance less ambiguous, why is there a whiteboard loading?
I don't know.
It says Greer's whiteboard. Okay. Sorry, my screen was interrupted there.
Yeah,
I think if we want to
sorry about that.
eliminate some of our ambiguity, and again, this is highly debatable in Washington, I think it should not be in the form of more explicit, strong support for Taiwan, but I think we need to be more explicit on the limits of our support for Taiwan. I think the dilemma is that for political and strategic reasons, Washington has arguably been drifting toward a one China, one Taiwan policy, which we explicitly told the Chinese we would not do, because there's growing support in Washington for not de jure independence, but de facto permanent separation. And this is what the Chinese believe is happening. I think this is partly because the change in leadership in Taiwan. I mean, for most of the last 40 years, Taiwan was under the leadership of the Nationalist Party that fled to the island during the Civil War in 1949, but still subscribed to the idea that there was one China and Taiwan was part of it. The democratic movement that grew out of the 1990s is now the ruling party, the Democratic People's Progressive Party of Taiwan. And they don't subscribe to that notion. They're moving in the direction of a one China, one Taiwan policy. And I think there's political calculus in Taiwan that Washington will ultimately support them for this. And my concern is that I think Washington is not sufficiently confronting the dilemma that this historical evolution has placed on our one China policy. Because frankly, our position on one China at this point historically is closer to Beijing's than it is to the leadership in Taiwan. And I think that has potentially profound implications for how this issue is going to be resolved. Anyway, there's many layers to that, but I think that that's why I think strategic ambiguity for now is better than the alternatives.
So in terms of how China has dealt with Hong Kong, do you think that if they were to kind of move back into Taiwan, they would have a similar kind of treatment of Taiwan as they have with Hong Kong, or leave more freedom to Taiwan?
Well, that's certainly the fear. I mean, and particularly because of what happened in Hong Kong in 2020, because the Chinese, I mean, and there's a long legislative and political and diplomatic history there as well. But the term that the Chinese used in both cases for many years was one country, two systems. We will allow two systems to coexist within the one country of China. And there were lots of commitments made and pieces of legislation drafted and a constitution for Hong Kong that was prepared and I would prefer not to get into an in-depth discussion of it, but I mean, there are diverging views on the extent to which China has abided by any of the commitments it made to the Chinese. But the fact that the prevailing view is that the Chinese have violated the level of autonomy that they had promised to Hong Kong, that has very much informed the resistance in Taiwan to the whole idea of the one country, two systems model being in any way applicable or welcome to them. I mean, it would very much depend on the circumstances. I mean, the Chinese will no doubt, I mean, they've been making promises for 30 years that they would essentially allow a high degree of autonomy for the Taiwan government. And whether they would be inclined to abide by that, I think is wholly dependent on what the circumstances and the scenario that would lead to unification would look like. I think the bottom line is that there's very few people in Taiwan who are eager to embrace unification with Taiwan because of what happened in Hong Kong.
Yeah. So our new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, appears to be a China hawk, based on some of his statements here, especially with respect to the Panama Canal. What's kind of the reality of Chinese influence in Panama? Do you have any feel on that?
Yeah, in fact, I remember working on this issue when I was still back in government 25 years ago, when this first percolated because of a Chinese economic presence on the Panama Canal. The bottom line is that China does not control the Panama Canal and probably could not control the Panama Canal. What we have there's a Hong Kong-based company called Hutchison Ports, which owns and operates ports on both ends of the Panama Canal. There are 5 ports on either side of the canal that ships that transit the canal use, but the ports have no control over who is allowed to go through the canal. This company has a close financial relationship with the Panamanian government, but it also has many other international shareholders, and its owner, a man who's actually, he was involved in it 25 years ago. He's still in charge. He's in nonagenarian now. His name is Li Ka-shing. He has close ties to the Chinese leadership, like most longstanding Chinese business people in Hong Kong have. But he's not always a big fan of political developments in China, and he's diversified a lot of his international relationships over the years. Like I said, these ports do not control access to the canal. They only serve about 40% of the ships that come through the canal. But I think that the fear or the presumption is that if there was some kind of a conflict scenario between China and the United States, that Hutchison, on orders from Beijing, because they're a Chinese-based company, would somehow try to obstruct or restrict access to the canal. But it's really not clear how quickly or effectively they could actually do that without Chinese military intervention, which is even harder to imagine given the almost inevitability of US military intervention in response to that. So there is a problematic scenario there. There's economic influence and political influence that Chinese economic entities exercise in places like Panama. But my own view is that the idea that the Chinese currently control the canal and are trying to take it, eliminate our access to it, I think is kind of an inflated conspiracy theory.
On kind of a broader level, how much concern to the U.S. is the China Belt and Road Initiative? Have we missed opportunities to kind of counter the Belt and Road because of their aggressive efforts in developing countries? And just recently, with the kind of suspension of USAID funding to a lot of projects around the globe, how has this affected China's position in terms of kind of re-entering or entering some of these developing country markets?
Well, I think there is both a challenge and an opportunity there for the Chinese and us, and I think we have missed opportunities. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative, it is a concern because it represents part of China's effort to extend its global influence through economic levers, in turn to win hearts and minds in its competition for, as I said at the very outset of our discussion, to maximize their wealth and power and influence relative to ours in the world. So in that sense, the Belt and Road Initiative does constitute an effort by the Chinese to score points against America. But it's not an effort to impose China's system on the rest of the world. And in fact, the Chinese have scaled back some of the Belt and Road. I mean, it was launched in 2013, so it's a dozen years old almost. And it's kind of amorphously defined. There's lots of projects that are part of it and some that aren't. But the Chinese have kind of scaled some of it back because of local resistance and because of inefficiencies and different priorities. But to your point, I think the biggest problem for the United States is that we have not been competing effectively against China's efforts to build international influence through an economic presence. We're not offering, the countries that Chinese are targeting are not seeing viable or attractive alternatives from us. There's a good friend of mine, Evan Feigenbaum, who's a China scholar of many years, and he's head of research at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington. And he's written several articles about this, but one of my favorite phrases of his is that whining is not competing. Complaining about Chinese international behavior doesn't compete against it. And China also has a kind of unfair advantage because it doesn't attach the kind of strings to a lot of its economic development projects that we do with regard to good governance and non-proliferation and environmental protection and anti-corruption and things like that. And even more to your point, I think that what we have seen unfolding in Washington in the last couple of weeks is it's opening doors and giving opportunities to the Chinese. There are advantages. I mean, China will have even more opportunity to take advantage of its advantages there as we retreat from providing foreign aid and assistance to other countries in the world. Now, aid and assistance is a subset of broader categories of economic presence. I mean, the BRI is largely about major infrastructure and investment programs, not just foreign aid and assistance, which is USAID. So it remains to be seen, in addition to the retreat from USAID's mission, what other things that the Trump administration might be pursuing that would represent a retreat from major infrastructure and investment projects in other countries in the world. To the extent that happens, I think it is providing opportunities for the Chinese, and it's diminishing our own opportunities to compete with the Chinese in these countries.
All right. Well, thank you. Just take a little segue here. If you have a question for Paul, you can post it in the chat, and when we get to the audience Q&A section, I will kind of track those questions, and you'll have an opportunity to ask your question in person. So, anyhow, as I said, if you have a question, you can post it in the chat area there, and we'll get to you probably around 10 to 8 or so. So to kind of switch gears a little bit, Chinese company just announced a significant AI breakthrough. I think the name of it is DeepSeek. Assuming this technology is all it appears to be, does this mean our strategy of kind of limiting export of chips and so forth to China has been a failure? The Christensen article actually sort of suggested that by limiting the amount of technology we exported, forced them into the situation of developing their own. What is your kind of take on that situation?
Yeah, well, I agree with Christensen on that. I mean, first of all, it remains unclear to me whether DeepSeek is, in fact, as you said, all it appears to be. And I'm certainly not technically qualified to comment on that. But I do think that the story about DeepSeek does highlight the potential downsides of what's been called decoupling and de-risking in Washington. The problem is that I don't think you're really, what we're calling de-risking is not really de-risking. It's exchanging one set of risks for another. Yes, we're minimizing the risks of supply chain reliance or dependence on China. But we're providing the Chinese with both the need and the opportunity to accelerate their own development. in response. And that's what's happened here. So the risk of cutting off U.S. technologies, cutting China off from U.S. technologies gives them, like I said, the incentive to develop their own. And I think that DeepSeek shows that China is finding ways to work around these restrictions and to maximize what it can do indigenously. And some of the analysis I've seen suggests that the Chinese could, as a result of this, it might help them to emerge as a world leader in finding more efficient and cost-effective approaches to the development of artificial intelligence. So, I mean, basically, the U.S. export controls are having an impact, but one of those impacts is encouraging the Chinese to mitigate the cost to them. I think ideally that, well, in an ideal world, the United States and China and the rest of the international scientific community should be working together to build AI under obviously mutually acceptable parameters that are the most, in ways that are the most productive and safe for the world. But in this kind of competitive environment, I think both sides are assuming risks.
Mm-hmm. All right. We haven't really talked about other players in the region yet. It seems that Japan and South Korea have been aligned with U.S. policy over the years. What are some of the pressures on Japan and China and Korea right now, especially with the new administration in place? And, they obviously very close to China geographically. And, what are the issues confronting them right now?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, my guess is that both the South Koreans and the Japanese, like the rest of Asia, are, currently kind of in a waiting mode and hedging their bets as they wait for what kind of clarity is going to emerge from the Trump administration and how they approach China. I think one of the problems over the last many decades, actually, is that many of the countries in the region, including and especially our closest allies, have kind of fluctuated between the fear of being abandoned to deal with China by themselves by the United States, abandoned by the United States to deal with China on their own, or on the other hand, fears of being dragged into or getting caught in the middle of an overly confrontational U.S. approach to China. And I think, frankly, both of those possibilities seem to be there as possibilities under the Trump administration. Because Trump has certainly, even in his first term and since, even during the campaign, he's talked about how the U.S. allies in the region need to be paying more for their own defense. And he's talked a lot about how eager he is to resume his friendship with Xi Jinping and work out all kinds of differences, the relationship that he thinks he has with Xi Jinping. And that makes a lot of people in the region, including Seoul and Tokyo, a little nervous about what interests of theirs might be overlooked in any kind of process like that. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people that have been brought into the Trump administration who have very strong hawkish views on China, a very hardline approach, and are not interested in accommodating China's role in the region or making concessions to China. And that plays into the other fear that our partners have, that China is our neighbor. We don't want to get dragged into a hostile relationship. So I think basically Seoul and Tokyo are going to be watching to see what consensus, or frankly, what discipline emerges within the Trump administration on how to approach China. I mean, for years, the region has been concerned about the reliability and the consistency of Washington's attention to the region, its attention span in the region, and particularly its attention to the interests of our partners, because they have priorities that are not entirely identical to ours, and they want to have functional relationships with the Chinese. I think this is even more an area of uncertainty now because of the questions that remained about what policy toward the region and toward China is going to cohere within the Trump administration.
So to kind of expand this discussion a little bit, China's been pretty aggressive in the South China Sea, building islands and so forth. And this has been a significant influence on the Philippines. China has essentially ignored rulings by the UN on the legality of their claims in the South China Sea. Is there any recourse that anybody has to kind of counter their behaviors there if they're going to ignore these rulings by the UN body?
Well, I think the recourse that Washington has been pursuing, and I think is going to continue to pursue, is to keep drawing attention to frankly, the illegality under international law of Chinese actions, but particularly in the case of the Philippines, to draw attention, as we have quite explicitly, to the existence of, unlike Taiwan, we have a defense pact with the Philippines. Goes back 70 some years. We provide military assistance. I think we're going to continue to do that. We've helped the Philippines closely monitor Chinese behavior in the region and their challenges to Philippine sovereignty or Philippine jurisdiction. And I think we've expanded U.S. military patrols in the region as well. I think there's a couple areas, though, where I think we need to be a little bit cautious. One is the need to continue to uphold our actual neutrality on the sovereignty claims themselves. There's a lot of arcane legal issues here. But what's surprising to many people is that the United States actually takes no position on which countries in the region actually have sovereignty over these islands in the South China Sea. And in fact, which of them constitute islands under international law, which has its own set of permutations. One thing on the plus side for the Philippines is that some of these features do fall under Philippine jurisdiction because they're within the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. And that's where some of this activity is going on now. So the Chinese are clearly in violation of that. But the other problem we have to be careful of, it kind of echoes what I said before about Taiwan. Strategic ambiguity on the Taiwan issue is designed to make sure that Taiwan doesn't take U.S. support for granted if there's no legal basis for it. In the Philippine case, we need to be careful not to let the Philippines take U.S. support for granted and push the envelope in terms of who has legal control over what. In some of these cases, particularly, there's a particular place called Second Thomas Shoal, which has been the center of activity. It's clearly under Philippine legal control and jurisdiction because it's within the Philippines exclusive economic zone. But the other interesting little wrinkle here is that the Chinese insist that anyway, at this place, Second Thomas Shoal, the Philippines, 25 years ago, deliberately grounded a former U.S. Navy ship that they had taken possession of for the purpose of asserting their presence at this shoal, which doesn't even constitute an island. The Chinese insist that the Philippines promised under a previous president or more that they would remove the ship at some point, or at least that would not make an effort to turn it into a permanent outpost. In the recent years, the Philippines has denied any such agreement. But the problem for us is that there is some evidence that there was one, and that evidence is the basis for what had been prior Chinese restraint on this. I think this just underscores the need to be cautious in wholeheartedly supporting what might be escalatory behavior by either side. But I think, the bottom line answer to your question is our recourse is we have a defense pact with the Philippines, and the Chinese are violating international law.
All right. Just to kind of maybe expand on this other player question a little more, the article by Christensen mentions the Quad Alliance, which includes Japan, Korea, Australia, and India. So we haven't talked about Australia and India. So India has been in the news in certain conflicts with China at their border, and also in terms of now they've exceeded them in population. So there's sort of bragging rights going on with this population issue. How are Australia, which is a supplier of raw materials to China, how are they faring in terms of the change of administration in the United States and also with China's kind of new assertiveness in the South China Sea.
Yeah, there's actually, I mean, India and Australia both have very complex relationships with China, but very different ones. I should say, by the way, the Quad is not really an alliance. It's really just kind of a forum at this point.
Mhm.
There's no defense uh, commitments involved. It's kind of an organization that was established over the last decade for those four parties to uh, collaborate on how to approach regional issues. The Chinese, of course, think that it's all aimed at them. And there's people in all four countries that will tell you that in some ways it is, but in any event, uh, with regard to India, India sees itself as a great power in its own right in the region. That's facing a challenge from China. And this is partly because of the history of China's relationship with Pakistan, which is it's not quite a strategic alliance, but it comes close historically. And this has always been a problem for the Chinese, or for the Indians. And of course, there are unresolved border disputes between China and India as well. But India has historically been very strongly inclined toward non-alignment. It likes to engage with the United States and the other members of the Quad, but it doesn't want to be seen as an ally because, like Indonesia, it's just been historically proud of its non-alignment. And in fact, the Chinese actually participate, and there's another forum that's in some ways even comparable to the Quad. It's called BRICS, where India and China are partners, along with Brazil and South Africa were the original, and Russia, but they've expanded that membership. So India is kind of playing it both ways, but they do try to cultivate a relationship with the United States as a counterbalance to China within limits. Which is why some of the other members, even of the Quad, are never quite sure of how committed the Indians might be to any uh, joint agenda they come up with. Australia is in a different, a clearer position. I mean, they're similarly caught in the middle because they have a vital trade relationship with China for reasons that you said. An important source of Chinese imports of raw materials. But Australia is a formal U.S. ally, unlike India, uh, but like Japan. And it shares the goal of preventing a kind of hostile, exclusive hegemony of China in the region. Obviously, Canberra is very closely aligned with Washington, but in recent years, because of our attention span, and even more so, I think, frankly, because of Trump, who had his own problematic relationship with the Australian Prime Minister during his first term, Australians are a little bit uncertain and ambivalent about the reliability of the United States as a partner and the reality of, well, the clarity on what U.S. regional ambitions are going to be, especially under Trump. So again, I think a lot of this is going to depend again on how Trump plays this relationship. And there's like I just said, there's still some uncertainty and some skepticism in Australia, which is I think been the strategic debate in Australia has been drifting toward more attention to, not an effort to assert autonomy from the United States, but an effort to assume the need to exercise more autonomy if Washington is less attentive.
All right. Well, actually, I think we'll switch over to do some audience Q&A right now. I'm going to save a last question for you to use your crystal ball to kind of predict the future here at the end. But we'll kind of allow some questions here from our audience. Matt Cohen, I think you were kind of the first one to get a question posted. So if you're out there, Matt.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
I
Yeah,
can.
thanks. Appreciate you taking the time to give us some good information. One thing I was interested to get your perspective on is sort of the matrix relationship that Taiwan has with China, where although they're separate entities, there's a lot of interconnectedness in the two nations or lands, you might want to say, such as the internet. The internet comes to Taiwan via Hong Kong. So it's not it's not as though there's, these two entities operate independently, sort of the way Japan and China does. So I don't know if you might speak a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I think, I mean, for historical and cultural and economic reasons, there's a lot of linkages, economic and social and cultural, between China and Taiwan. I mean, this has gotten a little fuzzier over the last several decades because of the length of the separation and the growing sense of a separate or a unique national identity in Taiwan. 30 or 40 years ago, if you polled the people in Taiwan, most of them would say, well, yeah, we're Chinese, but we're Taiwanese too, and right now we're functioning on our own. The number of people in Taiwan nowadays who identify as Chinese is dramatically less than it used to be. Most of the people in Taiwan see themselves primarily or as Taiwanese. Now, Beijing's perspective on this is we have cultural connections. You're part of the same fraternal family. I mean, this is in their rhetoric all the time. And they exploit that to the extent that they would, as much as they can, starting with the economic ties. I remember years ago hearing a statistic that 2030, there was some substantial percentage of the business community in Taiwan that was at any given point resident on the mainland conducting business. And we also know that the Chinese, I mean, my background is intelligence, the Chinese have infiltrated the Taiwan population, including the Taiwan military and government services, partly because, a lot of the conservative elements of the Taiwan government were from the Nationalist Party, which, from the 1940s through the 1980s and into the 90s, shared this common sense of being Chinese. And during, the KMT governments up through the year 2000, and then during the late 2000s, there was another. Anyway, I don't need to get into the deep depth of the political history of Taiwan, but there were a series of strengthening of economic and travel and cultural links that were made between the Chinese and the Taiwan authorities. But there has been a retreat from that under the DPP government, which is the historically pro-independence party. And in fact, the DPP government, the current president Lai Ching-te and his predecessor Tsai Ing-wen were from the DPP. And they talk openly about Taiwan already being a sovereign independent country. We don't need to declare independence. Now, it goes without saying that this is not consistent with the U.S. position on Taiwan's international status. But the links that you're talking about have become part of the back and forth, the tension between the two sides, because the Chinese try to maximize it for their advantage because they think that it gives them leverage in pursuing the goal of unification. But it's precisely for that reason that more recent governments on Taiwan have tried to limit the extent of those links. And in fact, there were youth student movements in Taiwan under the previous nationalist government from 2008 to 2012, or 2016, I think it was, yes, that they protested. More separatist-minded people in Taiwan have protested the nationalist government's efforts to strengthen the links. So this is really where part of that the contest is being fought right now, and it's a very central element. And we see it playing out now in a lot of very complex developments in internal Taiwan politics. Because although Lai Ching-te from the DPP, like I said, the historically pro-independence party, was elected last year, the KMT, the historically nationalist party, has control of the legislature. So they're fighting over these very issues, which raises a lot of questions about what consensus is going to emerge on the island about what kind of relationship with Beijing is viable.
All right. Thank you. Eric Johnson, you out there, Eric? I don't know if Paul kind of answered your question already, or you want any clarification?
Yeah, I wanted to know, and this gets into his opinion about in the next 20 years. What do you think? I mean, will China eventually take it over, or is there any chance it would remain independent for the next 2 decades?
Would it take over Taiwan or take over the world?
Well, I guess you could start with Taiwan.
Yeah, well, we can talk about Taiwan because, as I said, there's a separate argument about whether it's trying to take over the world. Uh, that's an excellent question, and in fact, I mean, it's really kind of one of the big questions in Washington right now. My own view, and yeah, this is kind of controversial, and I've written about this. The prevailing view in Washington is that China is trying to coerce Taiwan into unification. And, if you, from the Chinese perspective, it's not China that's changing the status quo or that's violating earlier commitments. Because the Chinese will be first to tell you that they never promised not to use force, even though there's a prevailing view that they did at some point. To me, the bottom line is that China wants to unify with Taiwan ultimately. It believes this is inevitable and it has to happen. But they don't want to use force. One of my kind of slogans is the Chinese aren't looking for an excuse or opportunity to attack Taiwan. They're looking for a reason not to, because they want to do this peacefully. The problem is Taiwan's not particularly interested right now for obvious reasons. And there's a political constituency in Washington that's clearly and obviously and with good reason more sympathetic to Taiwan than it is to Beijing. I think the problem in Washington, when I talked about this earlier, I said we're not confronting some of the underlying dilemmas of our policy. The U.S. position is that we're opposed to Taiwan, that we do not support Taiwan independence, but we also do not support any unilateral changes to the status quo. The problem is that over the last 30 years, all three sides, Beijing, Taipei, and Washington, have adopted their own definitions of the status quo, and they're not compatible with each other. And I think the Chinese think that's being challenged. We think the Chinese are impatient to resolve this. They think that we have retreated from our commitments because we are essentially, and again, this is just the Chinese position is that Taiwan has redefined the status quo to one in which Taiwan is, as I quoted the DPP earlier, that Taiwan is already a sovereign independent country. And as long as Washington continues to support the DPP leadership for whatever reason, the Chinese see that as underwriting this violation of the one China principle, the one China framework that 40 years ago, all three sides agreed to. You asked the question, what's going to happen within the next 20 years? It's hard to say, but I have to say I don't want to say I'm pessimistic, but I'm not optimistic because I think that the willful misunderstanding on all three sides of what the other side's position is not pointing us in a positive direction. My concern is that Washington sees this as purely a military deterrent problem, when I frankly think that it's not a military problem. It's a political and legal diplomatic problem that does not lend itself to military solutions. And as long as we approach it as a purely military problem, we're not going to address either Taiwan's or Beijing's clear concerns. So there's, as you can see, there's so many variables in this equation. But I think we're headed for trouble. And it's not because, as some people will tell you, that Xi Jinping has directed the Chinese military to take Taiwan in 2027 if it hasn't happened by then. What he has said is that he wants the Chinese military to have the capability to execute this mission if Taiwan, if Xi determines that it's necessary. The problem is that we're not giving China any reason to see a scenario for peaceful resolution of this. And there have been voices in Washington, including very recently, who said we should be done with it. We should recognize Taiwan as an independent country because permanent separation of Taiwan is in the strategic from the mainland is a vital strategic necessity for U.S. security in the Western Pacific. These are obviously irreconcilable positions, which are, again, kind of pushing toward a military approach all around to the issue. And I find that highly destabilizing.
All right, thank you. I think we have another question from, I'll just call you Eric, iPad Eric here. That's what you're,
I don't know how to change that.
okay, iPad Eric, go ahead.
But anyway, yeah, very interesting presentation. I very much enjoyed your comments. I just wondered, this is sort of at the 20,000-foot level. Going forward, some people have talked about their demographic challenges in the upcoming decades. And I just wonder if you have an opinion on how that might affect their economic and military political power going forward.
That's a great question. I don't have a real depth of expertise on demographics and frankly, either on economics, but I do know from my economic colleagues and demographic specialists that there is. I mean, the Chinese leadership, as much as whatever external ambitions they have, would much prefer to be left alone to deal with all of their internal systemic challenges. Their economy has been slowing down. And I think really the history of Chinese domestic politics or domestic policy over the last 40 years has been on what is the appropriate scope and pace of economic reform that could solve some of these problems without at the same time having the side effect of generating sources of domestic instability and unrest if the economy is out of control. And I think the demographic trend lines, these were identified by specialists, already a generation ago. China's getting older. And the welfare system of China, which is pretty well established, is going to become a lot more expensive than it has been, partly because of the one-child policy that Mao maintained during the Cultural Revolution and even earlier. You have, well, I mean, they've relaxed that, 10 or 15 years ago. I can't remember exactly. So that is shifting in its own way. But there's a lot more, there's a lot of aging people in China and fewer of their children to be able to provide for them. So the state has to find some way to make up that gap. And the line that my colleagues used to ask in government, which I think some analysts still ask, is China going to get old before it gets rich? And I think that's still an open question. So the demographic challenge is there because of the aging of the population and simply the fact that they have 4 times as many people as we do.
Just as kind of a follow-up to that question there, I've read some articles that the Chinese economy is not as robust as the official statistics would lead one to believe. That there's a lot of fudging and so forth from regional governments. Do you have any kind of opinions or insights into that?
Yeah, I think that historically has been the case. That, as long as they controlled information, the communist regime was always able to publish what number, fudge whatever numbers worked. But I think it's become harder for them to fabricate that. As the system has gotten more open and more exposed to the international community, it's harder to hide substantial lies about growth rates and things like that. So again, I may be a little dated on this, but I think, my economic specialist colleagues would tell you that I think that over the last 20 years, the statistics have probably become a little bit more accurate than they used to be. And I think the Chinese have just acknowledged that they, it was partly when they became some of the requirements of transparency that were necessary for them to join the World Trade Organization 25 years ago, kind of pushed them in that direction. So I think they still get nervous about the domestic political impact of speaking the truth on economic statistics And of course, they've got all kinds of incentives to play games with that in international trade and financial networks. But I guess my bottom line is I think they're a little closer to the truth than I grew up watching them.
All right. All right, Betty, you got a question?
Yeah, Paul, it's not so much a question as much as sort of thoughts on this. You mentioned at some point, I love this discussion on Taiwan. My children are from Taiwan, so I've paid close attention and I'm trying to remember, tell me quickly the year of ping pong. It was during Nixon's. Okay, I was still a young woman and not that I was any it was a brilliant analysis of Asian affairs, but I just thought, I don't like this ping pong diplomacy. I wasn't terribly excited about it. I hated to see Taiwan kind of thrown under the bus for the exchange, and trade was a major interest. But you mentioned young people, and I lived overseas for a long time, and when you take a look at the revolution that took place along in northern Africa into the Middle East, I can't think of the name of it now. The Arab Spring.
Oh,
The Arab
yes.
Spring. When I was working in Central Asia on a contract, and you mentioned it in Taiwan, young people do not want to live under authoritarian rule. They may not know a lot about democracy, but what they don't want to live under, and their glimpse of the world has been through the social media where they see those other ways to kind of and I don't want to get gushy about democracy, but they like choice. And they
Well, you're
don't
talking about young people in Taiwan or on the mainland?
in Taiwan now specifically. To the people, young people in Taiwan, what are their, do they want the authoritarian rule that's going to come with the mainland China? It's not going to be cozy. China may be calling it a one China policy. But at some point, we see what's happening in Hong Kong. Um, I can't imagine that young people want this. And do they have a voice? Does it even matter? We saw what happened with Arab Spring, but young people are really all over the world, and Ukraine, so many places. They do not want a dominant authoritarian rule. I'm not sure that they're clear about democracy, but they like the exchanges and the choices that they see in another system. Tell us about the young people in Taiwan, and do they even, Taiwan's population compared to mainland is so small anyway, and with young people, it's even smaller. What
Well,
happens?
yeah, but yeah, I mean, and I think Taiwan as a society is statistically younger than the mainland.
Yeah,
Well, and the issue with young people in Taiwan have pretty much only known democracy.
that's right.
And I mean, and a lot of people forget that Taiwan has experienced autocracy. The KMT, Chiang Kai-shek was a dictator. He was an autocrat. And this is one of the, I mean, and his legacy is one of the reasons that the Democratic People's Party was established. No one in Taiwan wants an autocratic government, and that's informed as much by their experience under the KMT as the prospect of the regime that would be imposed by the CPP. But I think this is it's part of the dilemma.
Yeah.
Lost my train of thought, but I think that there's well, I guess that was my point. And I mean, I think that they don't want autocracy. The question is, and they like prosperity, they like freedom, they like democracy. The question is, to what extent would Beijing fulfill any promises to allow any of that to remain? And because of what happened in Hong Kong, particularly to young people, the young people of Taiwan and the adults and the older people in Taiwan are not interested. Or well, some of them, old timers are still, they're nostalgic about one China because that was part of the KMT identity. But that was a long time ago. And there's too much skepticism about the honesty of any Chinese commitments to how they would govern the island if unification happened.
Well, it's a bit of a hopeless question. Like, it's not really one. What I saw in Central Asia was that only the older people really liked the idea of Russian when it was under the Soviet Union because of the security from cradle to grave. And the young people wanted nothing of it. But we can go on to the next question. My concern for the young people is that they're going to be handed something that they don't have much of a voice in. And I don't know if at some point, either in the mainland or in Taiwan, young people have an opportunity to really see that, or if they're just going to finally at some point acquiesce
Well,
and
no,
say, well, it's
actually,
just,
I think the young people in Taiwan have a very powerful voice.
do they?
And I think this is one of the things that's, kind of paradoxically feeding this dilemma. That there's a the U.S. support for democracy in Taiwan arguably causes tension with our commitments to Beijing.
Mhm.
And the Taiwan population is relatively young, and I think they have a big voice in Taiwan politics. The problem is that this is I think underscoring this inherent dilemma in the strategic triangle between China, Taiwan, and the mainland. Because the young people in Taiwan and the DPP thinks that the Chinese Civil War, we were not a party to that. And it ended when Chiang Kai-shek died. The problem is, historically in Beijing and Washington, you can't make that argument. The Chinese Civil War it has not ended because the Taiwan issue has not been resolved. And the paradox, I don't think of a better way to describe it, that the population of Taiwan thinks it's irrelevant to them because they weren't consulted. They're right, but history is not erased by more recent history. There's still a trap there that Taiwan is caught in that was made collectively by Beijing, Washington, and Chiang Kai-shek. This is the dilemma I'm talking about. The population on Taiwan has outgrown it, but the commitments of the three communiques are still there.
I think Eric, excuse me, Matt Cohen had kind of a comment he wanted to add to this discussion. You there, Matt?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, for better or worse, the U.S. and Taiwan have an from an economic standpoint in that TSMC and several other major
Oh, yes.
semiconductor manufacturers are based in Taiwan, and we've been very critical of Taiwan exporting that technology to China for for many years. So it's people in Taiwan, it's I mean, I think we have to be very careful not to look at them as indistinct of their relationship to democracy and the other westernized nations in Asia like South Korea and Japan, because it's in a lot of ways the economic livelihood of a person in Taiwan is not much different than someone in Taiwan, in Japan or South Korea. It's where we kind of we kind of stratify the opinions of people there in different ways. It's not simply like in America where freedom is our ultimate ambition. There could be many ambitions that you have in a place like Taiwan in addition to freedom, so.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, Taiwan is a very important international economic actor, and not only because it produces, what is it, 90% of the highest quality microchips that much of the rest of the world is dependent on. That makes the geostrategic equation, even more complicated.
Mhm. All right, we have a question from Claire Collins. I think we're going to switch gears maybe a little bit here with Claire.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, I can.
Okay. I wanted to know, will China be more open with the World Health Organization in sharing data on COVID-19? And they be more open with the world in the future. Not open in spreading, but I mean open in sharing their data.
That's an excellent question. I fear that the answer is no, not particularly more open than they have been. I mean, for a couple of reasons. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party system is, inherently secretive by nature. And they know, even though they won't admit it, that they made some major mistakes in preventing COVID from spreading further. There's a constituency in China for maximizing international, medical exchange of information. There's a lot of expertise there. In fact, I would recommend there's a really excellent book called Wuhan that was published by a scholar at the University of Chicago named Dali Yang that really tells the story of what happened in China during that first month of COVID. The problem is that the Chinese are not inclined to share information for three reasons. Medical information. One is it's a communist system and they like to keep secrets. Two is, like I said, they made mistakes that they don't want to expose or advertise. And three, they've been so criticized for being the cause of international COVID that's just kind of reinforced their resentment. On the other side of the equation, they've tried to cultivate a relationship with the WHO. And now that, frankly, President Trump has withdrawn the United States from the WHO, the Chinese might see more incentive to cooperate with it, because that would allow them to fill the gap that we apparently are willing to create of, China wants to be seen as a responsible international player on issues like this. And now they can try to capitalize on their relationship with the WHO to influence what it knows and how it spreads information and who gets credit for these things internationally. So I think it depends on some of these trend lines going forward, but I don't think we're going to see any more. If your question was specifically about the origins of COVID, because I don't think the Chinese themselves know what happened yet. I don't think we'll ever know because whatever data there is dated.
Hey, that brings up an interesting question, and I know you're not an expert on this, but I'll just see what your opinion might be. I saw today that Italy is thinking of dropping out of the WHO, and I also saw that Argentina has already dropped out of the WHO after Trump did. So is this organization have value to the world? I mean, what's going on here with this? Is this going to lead to kind of pandemics that we don't anticipate because nobody's participating in in this data collection?
Well, that's a good question, and it's a complicated one. I think that the WHO, again, I'm not an expert on this at all. I don't know anything about epidemiology or international health, but I think the WHO stumbled in a couple respects in the way it handled COVID. And I think that gave a lot of countries in the world an incentive to criticize it politically. That for example, the WHO was a little bit too complacent or too acceptant of the Chinese explanations of what was going on. So my guess is that Brazil and Italy, I wasn't familiar with that or what reasons they gave, but my guess is they're probably similar to the reasons that President Trump gave. That this is a not entirely responsible organization that's a little bit too responsive to communist regimes. And if you already have complaints against them, you can probably find fault with the level and depth of expertise they have and their responsibility. And since it's an organization which, as far as I understand, is entirely dependent upon contributions from member countries, it's easy to make the argument, well, why should we be spending tens or millions or whatever we're contributing to this organization if it's not, performing as it should be? My guess is that some of the criticism was exaggerated. My guess also is that, to answer your question, Ray, I think to whatever extent it is hobbled through lack of participation or lack of funding, I think it frankly is going to increase the potential for international health crises to develop more quickly or without, the kind of monitoring that full, meaningful collaboration through an organization like that is designed to deal with. And again, it's hard to comment on it without, implying political judgments, but I think it's one of those things that's been politicized, and I think it's unfortunate that it has, regardless of the validity of, the faults of the organization.
Did have a question from Deb Meyer. She wanted to know the author of that book, Wuhan. Do you know?
Dali Yang, D-A-L-I. His last name is Yang, Y-A-N-G.
Thank you.
It's actually it's a really excellent book. One of my a colleague at Princeton described it. It's all about the origins of COVID and how the regime handled it. The political scholar at Princeton described it as one of the most important books on Chinese politics that he'd ever read. And I was skeptical of that until I read it. If you want to see how the Chinese system operates, this is a really excellent book.
All right. Well, thank you for that reference. One thing we didn't talk about yet, and I kind of was an oversight, is what about Russia? What's the relationship China has with Russia, and how does that affect us?
Oh my, that's another huge question.
Yeah.
Well, China has what they call a strategic partnership with Russia, and there's many layers to this. I think it's overly simplistic to say that it's based on a shared desire for promulgating authoritarian rule in the world. They certainly have that in common, but I don't think that's their agenda. I think what they have what more operative that they have in common is they share a disregard for the U.S. way of conducting international affairs. They think the United States is, hegemonic and interventionist, and alienates developing world countries. So I think their shared objective is to kind of right size the international role of the United States in the multipolar world order. And more specifically, and again, there's a lot of layers to what I just said, but with regard to the war in Ukraine, I think it's a mistake to judge that the Chinese like this war because it serves their purposes and it reinforces their relationship with Russia. I'm pretty confident that Xi Jinping did not want this war to happen and wants it to end as soon as possible. Whatever tactical benefits it derives from the fact of the war in Ukraine, I think are outweighed by the international loss in credibility that the Chinese have had by their tacit support for it. Well, more than tacit support. I mean, the Chinese have diplomatically made an apologist for what the Russians are doing. And the reason and again, as a Cold War historian, I mean, this point has been made by others, but I think it's very important. I think the Chinese are the extent to which they support Russia in the war in Ukraine, it's because they genuinely agree with Russia that it was the United States' unwillingness to acknowledge legitimate Russian security concerns historically in Eastern and Central Europe that was one of the drivers of the war. Well, specifically, the Chinese agree. They agree that NATO expansion under the leadership of the United States was the wrong approach to dealing with Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Russian ambition was that NATO should have been replaced in the 1990s by some new security architecture in Europe that incorporated Russia rather than excluded and targeted it. And the Chinese are sympathetic to that view because they frankly see U.S. security policy in East Asia as excluding and targeting China rather than incorporating it into our approach to multilateralism there. I think that is the core element of what binds the Russians and the Chinese together. Their shared opposition to what they see as the U.S. desire to sustain a U.S.-led international order. I think, and we're going to see what happens now, because as of today, Trump is launching an effort to negotiate, to begin the process of negotiating a settlement to the war. The Chinese have offered to do this previously without taking ownership of the process. The bottom line is that because of their agreement on so many principles, the Chinese, they want the war to end, but they don't necessarily want to see Putin win everything he wants, but they don't want him to lose. They want some kind of negotiated settlement, which they've, for the last 2 years have said is the only way to resolve this. Again, that was kind of a scattershot. There's a lot of different layers to the China-Russia relationship of what it means for us, but I think the bottom line is that one. They don't like the way the world, the United States acts internationally, and they've joined forces to push back against it and to draw other countries into a similar approach.
Mhm. All right, we're coming up on our end time here. I told you I'd give you one shot at kind of a crystal ball prediction. What do you see for China for in the next 10 to 15 years in terms of, what are the headwinds they're going to confront? What are the advantages they have in terms of moving forward?
Well, it's a mixed bag, and it's a really complicated equation. I think that I think China's going to, I started out by saying that I think their strategic objective has been to maximize their wealth and power and influence in the world relative to that of the United States, so that they don't have to be subordinate to us into perpetuity. And I think they're going to continue to accumulate wealth and power and influence internationally, especially if, as some now suspect, the United States is going to be retreating from a more expansive role in the world, and in fact, from a more consistently reliable role in the world, especially with regard to the countries in the developing world that is known as the global south, or even in Europe. The ambivalence that a lot of countries in the world, including our friends and allies, have about the direction the Trump administration is going to pursue, and I won't make any comments on foreign policy, but I think the ambivalence that other countries have creates opportunities for China to score points in that contest. I think on the minus side, that China has the disadvantages of major, like I said, systemic economic internal problems that could affect regime stability, and the leadership is notoriously and kind of intrinsically neuralgic about this. And they also have the disadvantage of having a really bad international reputation that allows us to score points against them. But I think it really, on the balance sheet, and I don't know how balanced it is, but on the advantages side, the Chinese have their growing strength in the historical shifts in the balance of power since the turn of the century, based primarily on their economic influence. They frankly, I think, have a more coherent strategy for pursuing their objectives than is apparent yet in Washington. They have a lot of empathy, if not support, in the global south, who share their concerns about U.S. international behavior. They certainly have strong and decisive leadership. And I hate to say it, but they also have the advantage of the U.S. being very much preoccupied with our own internal political, dare I say it, dysfunction, which the Chinese are going to continue to take advantage of to the extent they can. Whether the vulnerabilities are going to outweigh their advantages depends a lot on a couple things. I guess I would just say, the sustainability of their economic growth rates, because that's really the primary basis for the legitimacy of the regime domestically. and the sustainability of the trajectory of U.S. power, which is going to be a product or a function of how the next 4 years and beyond unfold here.
All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been a terrific presentation you've done tonight. Really, I learned a lot about this complex relationship that we have with China and their complex relationship they have with their other neighbors. So really appreciate you taking the time to be with us tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Betty to kind of take us home here.
Thank you, Ray. Well, that was very sobering, Paul, to say the least. Something you said at the end reminded me that these struggles, most of the world has known nothing but an authoritarian or an autocratic rule through either monarchs or emperors or chiefs. And democracy, as Cleopatra once said, is messy. She herself being very autocratic in Egypt and stared across to the Mediterranean, knew democracy well through Caesar and through the second man that she was married to, deeply involved. I can't think of it now. But it was messy. It was so much easier to simply be a dictator. And it's interesting when you mentioned that China is simply humming along with their own problems, but as long as they cling to the idea of an autocratic rule, then it's fairly consistent and the world can count on that consistency. And we have something called democracy, and we can vote in people who bring a different trend. And we're seeing definitely one that is a jarring trend. And it's a concern.
Actually, on that point, I think one of the scary things is that the Chinese will argue that their system right now is working better for them than ours is for us.
Well, yeah, because once again, when you're authoritarian rule, you just go from one authoritarian rule to the other, and people are used to that, and there's no avenues or chains. That's why I was asking about young people. Do young people feel any sense of hope in any of these when they don't see an opportunity to really of authentic engagement? And we want to promise that in a democracy, don't we? That you can have this authentic engagement through this representative democracy and and so forth. And I hope it doesn't end up just as a philosophical discussion for us, but we'll see. We'll see. And next week we go from Asia to the Middle East, and I'm sure that'll be another sobering conversation. Our subjects this year are all very sobering. I want to say very quickly that this is the Great Decisions Program series. We are going to be with the Middle East next week, and we're going to be back to Asia the following week, ending up February with India, but China, the West. This will include India and the global South. You mentioned the global South today, and I think it's really important. Perhaps we'll have a quick sort of how did we come to talk about the global North and the global South. I'll say very quickly in March that we're going to have AI and national security. This is really important for us to talk about. We had a program last year on artificial intelligence. Well, it's beyond now. What is it? We're not going to be describing what is the motor made of. What we want to know is what is AI's impact on national security? Do we need to be concerned? We know what happens when we think I ought to buy a pair of shoes. The next thing you know, your social media is flooded with shoe ads. Well, I didn't even say the word out loud or even go to an ad. So it's a little scary. For those of us who remember the movie 2001 Space Odyssey, I'm just saying we've got hell on our hands. American foreign policy at a crossroads. That'll be with Ambassador Quinn, who was with us this evening. NATO, safeguarding liberal democracy, another very hot topic. And then week 8, U.S. changing leadership in the world economy. These are heavy topics, but they're absolutely vital right now. And we want you to come back. Again, I don't think it's too late for you to become a member. And for $30, you can go to all 8. Which is really great. Otherwise, I believe it's $10 for non-members and $5 for members. I will say that starting in April, we'll go back to our regular program series, Global Speaker Series. And this year we're doing something a little different. Our programs are serious programs because this is our mission. We're taking a look at global, urgent timely matters going on in the world and for your credible sources. And I hope you agree with me that we do. Like this evening speaker, Paul, this was just, you were outstanding. You gave us so much information and so much data. And I hope people were taking notes. It was an excellent program. Thank you so much. We're going to be ending on a lighter note, though, for this year, which is something unusual for us. In April, we're having an in-person program. For those of you who have missed that, it's going to be music as a global language at the Indie Global Village. It'll be in April. Stay tuned for that. And then we are also going to end the program year in May with another in-person program on Indianapolis as a global city and the intersections with education and culture. And that's not to say we are not abandoning our virtual programs at all, but stay with us. Stay with us with these virtual programs where you get all of the speakers. We just decided to do something a little different this year, to end something on light. And I think we're going to agree that given everything that's going on, we need to probably end with a light note. So it's going to be good. Again, Paul, thank you very much for joining us. Love to have you back again. Your expertise on this matter is noted. So there may be a part two, but that probably will be for a few months, for a while. We do follow the programs the foreign policy does give us. But we're not obviously done with this, because what is China going to do? What is mainland going to do with Taiwan as the whole world is watching? Thank you for joining us. We say good night, and we look forward to seeing all of you again next week, when Pierre Atlas will be joining us, and many of you know him. He's on our board.
And I'll just say thank you as well. It was a privilege and a pleasure to engage with you all.
Well,
Thank
thank you all very much. I'm so glad the Chicago Global Council said, yes, we have the speaker for you. They are right. Thank you very much.